Hi, everyone. We're waiting 2 to 3 minutes before starting the webinar to accommodate for the rest of the attendees who are in the middle of connecting. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for being a part of this community. And just a few reminders before starting this call. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly. We will post the recordings on our community at aka.ms/security-webinars, and these links I have posted also in the IM window. And during this time, please feel free to ask questions at any time by typing them in the live event Q&A window by clicking at the Ask Question button. Be aware that any questions you post will be publicly visible. However, if you prefer, you can post your question anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter it. We often get many questions on these webinars, and we'll do our best to respond to all of them in real time. In the event, if the answer was not provided, or if you may have additional questions post this event, please don't hesitate to raise them on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. If you're listening to this after the fact as recording, that's also a great place to ask questions. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. You can do so at aka.ms/security-webinar-feedback. And while you are there, please join our community by visiting aka.ms/security-community. That's the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements. On our community, you can speak directly to our engineering teams that create our security products, and you will be able to influence our product designs and get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews. You can sign up for that at aka.ms/security-private preview. And while you're there, you can request features. You can give feedback, review our product roadmaps, attend in-person events, or join webinars like this. We basically believe that the best way to improve our products is by removing any barriers between you and the people that create them. So we hope you'll join us. In today's session, Jason will take us through a deep dive on threat intelligence with Azure Sentinel. Jason Westcott is a principal PM manager from our Sentinel team. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jason. Jason, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Balon. So welcome everybody to the deep dive on threat intelligence in Azure Sentinel. As Balon mentioned, my name is Jason Westcott. I'm a principal PM for Azure Security, focusing on Azure Sentinel. I'm responsible for all of the threat intelligence features in the product, as well as some of the built-in analytics that you'll see in the product. So let's get started. So I think what helps when we start talking about threat intelligence is to really get a little crisp on some of the terminology, because threat intelligence is really a big term. It could mean a lot of different things. At its heart, when we talk about threat intelligence, it's really anything related to a threat to your infrastructure or your enterprise's people, your organization, your assets. And threat intelligence is represented in many, many different forms. It could be something as rich as a very detailed report on a threat actor group, such as those put out by our Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center folks. Those reports, detail the motivations of an actor, they detail the infrastructure that actor is using, all sorts of rich information. Threat intelligence, as you can see here, could be about compromised accounts. It could be tools that folks are using to do hacks. It could be samples of malware, lots of different things. In Sentinel, we actually are really focused on these two pieces, observed data and indicators. So indicators are really representative of a particular threat. This could be something like communicating with a command and control. It could be something like as innocuous as a source of spam that is unwanted in your organization. And the observed data is the actual pieces of information, or the entities, if you will, that you'll actually see observed in your organization. So these could be things like IP addresses that you see in your network. They could be hosts that are compromised. They could be files that are representative of malware. It could be dangerous URLs that are used for phishing. So observed data and indicators are the things that are really effective within something like a SIEM, like Azure Sentinel. And the reason they're effective is because these are the things that are actually able to be matched very easily with your organization's log data, which is what you're inputting into your SIEM. So the objects you see here are representative of a format that is used to represent threat intelligence. That format is called sticks. And so, again, observed data and indicators are what we're really going to be talking about mostly today. So threat intelligence is an interesting topic for Azure Sentinel because it actually is not specific to one area of the product. Threat intelligence is scattered throughout the product, and it actually enhances every aspect of the product. So all of these areas that you see, data connectors, notebooks, hunting, analytics and workbooks and investigations, all of these areas are actually enhanced by virtue of you adding your company's threat intelligence to the product. And we'll walk through each of these today to get a deep dive on how threat intelligence actually lights these areas up. So the first thing that folks need to understand is that Azure Sentinel doesn't come with threat intelligence built into the product in the sense that when you open up Azure Sentinel, you don't have a repository of threat intelligence sitting there supplied by Microsoft at this time. So the idea is that you have threat intelligence for your organization. You're curating it in some fashion, possibly in a threat intelligence platform, like some of the ones that you see on the first line above. and you're deciding what to apply that threat intelligence to, be it your firewalls, your SIEMs like Azure Sentinel, or your other security controls. So the first thing you need to understand is how to get data, threat intelligence data, into Azure Sentinel. And so there's everything that you get into Azure Sentinel comes in through what we call data connectors. And if you look in the lower right, you'll see that we have 2 data connectors specific to threat intelligence in the platform. The first one is a threat intelligence TAXII, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the second one is threat intelligence platforms. So threat intelligence platforms is used when you have a threat intelligence platform like those MISP or Threat Connect or MindMeld or Anomaly or some other that is integrated with Azure Sentinel, such that directly from that platform you can push threat intelligence into Azure Sentinel. And so that's what that connector is for. If you happen to be using a custom solution, so perhaps you have a homegrown threat intelligence solution for your organization, we have an API called Microsoft Graph Security API that you can use in any number of different languages to write your own integration from that platform to Microsoft and send threat intelligence up to us. The other thing we have in this category is Azure Logic Apps, which is our automation platform. So Azure Logic Apps has built-in connectors for Azure Sentinel to push threat intelligence. It's very easy to write a connector that reaches out to an API from a third party source of threat intelligence. For example, we have a white paper that was written by one of our field folks, and I'll provide a link later in the document. But we've got Alien Vault OTX threat intelligence, Azure Logic App example where they wrote a logic app that just uses the REST API connector to connect to Alien Vault, pull in the threat intelligence, and use the built-in Microsoft Graph Security API threat logic app connector to push that back into Azure Sentinel. So it's a really good pattern to work with if you don't have a threat intelligence platform that is natively integrated with Azure Sentinel. And then lastly, we have the TAXII server connector. So as you saw on the last slide, we've got STIX, which is a format of representing threat intelligence. It's kind of the most common format that's used out there in the industry. Well, TAXII is the protocol that's used to transmit that format. And so there's lots of different TAXII servers out there. So if you have a TAXII server or a threat intelligence platform that supports TAXII, you can use the TAXII connector to pull in data into Azure Sentinel. And we will walk through examples of both of these. So let's take a look at the platform's data connector first. So the platform's data connector, if you look at Azure Sentinel, all of our data connectors are located in the same place. Go to data connectors, scroll down to the 2 threat intelligence ones. The platform's data connector, if you open it up, ours is already connected, but it has instructions here on what you need to do. Under the covers, this connector is using the Microsoft Graph Security API. And so those tip platforms that were listed on the last slide are natively integrated with this API. But because Microsoft Graph API requires registration of an application, we're going to walk through how that's done. So what I mean by that is, in order to talk to the Microsoft Graph API, you have to essentially do some virtual paperwork. You register an application that's going to represent this connection, and you give that application a certain level of permissions. In this case, we're going to be asking to be able to push indicators to Microsoft. And once you've done that, then you can use the information in that application registration, input that into your tip to make your connection to Microsoft. So let's take a look at how that's done. So let's say I had the Anomaly threat stream platform, and I wanted to make an application in my Azure Active Directory to represent that threat stream application. I would come over to Azure Active Directory. I would go to App Registrations, and I would say I want to create a new registration. And give it a name. I would say when you register an application in Azure Active Directory, you can either make that application available to the whole world, or you can make it only available to your particular tenant. That's what we're going to do in this case, because we are only interested in authorizing this application to write threat intelligence for my particular organization. So I'll click register. And what happened in the background is I got this thing called an application ID, which is very important. This is the numerical representation of the application, and this is the numerical representation of my organization. We call those a tenant ID. And these two pieces of information are going to be required when we go over to Anomaly Threat Stream and configure that, or any of the other tips, or if you have a custom application and you're building an integration directly with the API. It's always these two pieces of information that you'll be after. So we registered the application, so we have an ID, but we didn't give it any permissions yet. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go to API permissions. We do not need user read in this case. The Microsoft Graph, of which the API we're connecting to, has a lot of different APIs in it. Many of those have to do with users in your organization and productivity applications from Office. We don't need any of that for this particular thing, so let's get rid of that application, or excuse me, that permission, since we don't need it. And we'll add the permissions that we do need. Again, we're going to be connecting to the Microsoft Graph, so let's choose that. When you choose Microsoft Graph and you're looking at app permissions, there's two different kinds of permissions. There's delegated permissions, which means when you connect to the API, you're connecting as a signed-in user, or you can connect using application permissions, meaning your application is going to connect not as a user, but actually just representing itself. And in that case, it uses an app secret as a password. So that's the style we're going to choose here. And we will go down to threat indicators, which is what we're going to be pushing to Microsoft. And we want to say we need to read and write, because we're going to be sending indicators. And we'll add that permission. So you can see that's been added to my manifest, but in reality, nothing really has happened here other than paperwork. You can see that this permission actually has not been granted to the application yet. And because we're talking about sensitive data, some of these threat indicators can be quite sensitive. You don't want just anybody in your organization to be able to do this. This is a privileged permission that requires administrator consent. So what that means is that somebody in your organization that has sufficient permissions has to come in here to the app registrations and actually click grant consent for this application. It'll ask me if I really want to do that. And when I do, now this application has actually been granted the permission. The last piece of information we need, again, besides the application ID and the tenant ID, is we need to get an app secret, because again, the style of permission we chose is application permission, which means we're not connecting as a user, we're connecting as the app, and the app needs an app secret. So let's go over and get one of those. And we'll say new client secret. And we'll go ahead and grab it. And so at this point, if you're actually going through these steps, you should grab the secret now, because when you come back later, you will not be able to see it after this point. It's going to be hidden. So take it now and store it someplace safe like Azure Key Vault. So we'll grab the secret and we're good to go. So we have three pieces of information now: the app secret, the app ID, and our tenant ID. And these are the settings that we need when we go to our threat intelligence platform and actually push data to Microsoft. So I won't get into logging into Anomaly or Palo Alto or MISP or any of that stuff in this particular talk, just given the sake of time. But again, those are the three pieces of information that all of those platforms require when you're establishing a connector to push threat intelligence to Microsoft. So assuming you've done that successfully and gone to that threat intelligence platform, you're almost done. It means you're sending information to Microsoft. The last step you need to do is come over here to your data connectors and simply choose the platform's connector and go down to the bottom and click the connect button. Again, ours is already connected. You can see that we've been sending data in over the last few days. And that's it. In order to click this connect button, you do have to have certain rights. You do have to have a certain role in the tenant. We don't want just anybody to be able to stand up an instance of Sentinel and to grab all your threat intelligence for your organization. So we require that the users that click this connect button have to have a limited administrator role of either global admin, security administrator, or security reader. And of course, like all the other data connectors in Sentinel, you do need to have workspace read and write permissions. And you can see that I've got both of those. So just a quick summary. You have to register an app to represent your connection from your threat intelligence platform to Microsoft. You have to configure your threat intelligence platform to send indicators to Microsoft. And you have to go in and click the Threat Intelligence Platform Connect button. And once you've done that, after about 10 minutes after you click the Connect button, you should start seeing Threat Intelligence stream into Microsoft. And after that, as data gets sent from your Threat Intelligence Platform, typically we see about a 120-second delay from the time it leaves your Threat Intelligence Platform to the time it shows up in Sentinel. And that's a continuous push. All of those threat intelligence platforms push continuously. So let's take a look at the other data connector for getting threat intelligence into Microsoft. This is the TAXII data connector. And so this allows you to connect to any TAXII server out there that supports TAXII 2.0. So this is a very important note. TAXII has different versions. The versions between TAXII version 1 and TAXII version 2 are very, very different. TAXII 2.1 has now been ratified. So Azure Sentinel supports TAXII 2 and 2.1. We do not support TAXII 1 or 1.1. So very important to note that when you're looking around for TAXII servers, make sure that it is a TAXII server that supports 2 or 2.1. So with the TAXII connector, you're able to connect to any number of TAXII server collections. So in the world of TAXII, they have these things called collections. You can think of a collection as a feed. Generally speaking, you'll connect to something like IBM's X-Force Threat Intelligence or Anomalies Threat Stream, their limo service. And what you'll find there is a library of what they call collections. And each of these collections is typically themed. Something like a URL, malicious URLs, or command and control IP addresses, or malware domains. These types of themes are what you'll see on these collections. And typically they'll send one type of indicator, a whole feed of IP addresses, or a whole feed of domains, or a whole feed of file hashes, these sorts of things. So let's go ahead and connect to one, and we'll say test server. So in the world of TAXII, you need this thing called the API root URL. Generally speaking, when you go to the vendor who's supplying the threat intelligence, they'll list what the root URL is. In this case, we're going to try connecting to Anomalies Limo service. Their root URL looks like this. Interestingly, it says v1, but it's actually TAXII 2. And then you need to specify the collection ID. This could either be a name, or it could be a number, or it could be a very long string of letters and numbers, like a GUID. In the case, Anomaly uses short numbers. 107 happens to be the fish tank or OpenFish. I'm not sure which. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's OpenFish URLs. And if the TAXII server requires credentials, this is where you'll put them in. The limo feed is very well protected with username guest and password guest. But sometimes, like IBM, for example, when you sign up for their service, you'll get an API key and an API secret. That's where you'll put in the API key as the username, and the API secret will be your password. So let's go ahead and connect this particular collection. And we can see up here that it succeeded. And we've got our collection added. as the indicators come in, this last indicator received column will show you the time stamp of the last indicator that you got. And over here, I can remove it if I don't want it anymore. And I can add any number of these. So I could add another one using the same root. Oops. Another one. And so now I've got a second feed coming in from the same limo service. So again, there's really no limit here. You can add as many of these as you want. Lots of different sources of threat intelligence out there, from open source to paid feeds. And TAXII servers is a very common thing that you'll see out there in the world. So you've got threat intelligence in. Again, for the TAXII server, you have to discover the server collections. There is a way on the command line to go through and actually enumerate the different collections that are on a given feed if the TAXII server documentation doesn't already specify that on their website. I have a blog that I'll mention at the end of this talk, which actually walks you through how to do that on the command line. If you start with the root URL, you can use a command line tool called curl to actually connect and enumerate the different collections. You can actually look at the indicators that are being supplied by that threat feed as well, if you wish. So once you've got threat intelligence connected in either of those connectors, where do you find it in the product? You find it in logs, which is where you find all the data that you put into Azure Sentinel. And in the case of threat intelligence, it lands in this table called Threat Intelligence Indicator. And you'll find that under Security Insights. And what you see here on the right is an example of an indicator format. This happens to be a URL indicator. If this was a file hash indicator, it would look slightly different, but at the end of the day, they're all pretty simple. The observable is down here. In this case, it's a URL, and the threat type is listed as a malware URL. And the description in this case, it came from a source called URL house. I can show in the product exactly where this stuff is, just in case it's easier to see real time. Security Insights is where we find this table, and Threat Intelligence Indicator is our table. So I can go ahead and if I wanted to look at what these in this case, I'm saying, give me all my indicators that I've got in the last 24 hours by source system. You can see that I used to have quite a few in here, but I deleted them before this talk. So I've got several different feeds of TAXII that I've input into this over time, and I've got stuff that's coming in through the Microsoft Graph as well. I can go ahead and just say 5, take 4. If I want to get an example of one, and you can see this is what an indicator looks like, and the malicious URL, and here it is. Don't go there, it's bad. Right, so you've connected your threat intelligence. That's the hard part. You've found where it is in the product. It's important that it lands in the threat intelligence indicator table, because all of the other areas of the products are looking for threat intelligence in that table. And so if you get your threat intelligence in that table, you've basically enabled all sorts of functionality out of the box. And so the most common thing that people want to do with threat intelligence, of course, is use it to match against the other data that they put in the product to see if any of the data that they have in the product actually matches the threat intelligence. And so we do that in Azure Sentinel through this area called Analytics. So Analytics is where you create rules, and those rules, here's an example of a rule here where we're saying, I want to run this rule every hour. I want to look over the last 14 days, and I want to compare my threat intelligence with the data that's coming in on a particular log type. In this case, it's Azure Activity, and I want to say I want to match any IP addresses in my threat intelligence with Azure Activity logs, and I want to create alerts and incidents if I find a match. When you're creating rules, analytics rules in Azure Sentinel, you want to make sure that you're doing this activity called mapping entities. You can see on the lower right here, we've got these mapped entities. In this case, we're mapping an IP address and an account. The account is coming from the Azure Activity log, and the IP address is coming from both the Azure Activity log and the threat intelligence. Mapping entities is important because it tells Sentinel that this is a known thing. This is something I know what to do with. And when you generate an alert based on a mapped entity, you'll be able to do what's called investigation. There'll be an investigation button, and that will enable this view, which has nodes and edges and lets you see all the entities in a graphical format, click on those entities and get additional information about them. And so we've supplied, Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center has actually written 26 different rules related to threat intelligence matching for Azure Sentinel. And all of those rules are in the product, and they're prefixed with the TI map. And so we can go back to the product real quick and show what those look like. If you go to the rule templates and you type TI map, you'll see all of the 26 rules. We can sort by name. These rules all effectively work the same way. They take a particular type of threat indicator. In this case, we're going to look at domain indicators, and they map it to, they're looking for matches in a particular log type. In this case, it's looking in your common security logs, which is your Ceph logs. The next one is looking for domain indicators in DNS event logs, right? So you can see the logic behind all of these is quite similar. The details in the actual query differ only in that different log types require different extraction for the entities. So you'll see some regular expressions expressed differently in each of these because things like syslog, there's a lot of regex. Other logs like DNS events are quite simple because there's a column dedicated to IP addresses or domains in that particular log. So extraction of that data is very easy, but effectively the logic is the same. Take all of my threat intelligence and match it with the last hour, in this case, of log data. You can configure any of these settings when you're creating the rule. You can go ahead and say, I actually want to change the logic to do a different look back. Instead of every hour, I want to do it every few minutes or every day. This is the place where you do your entity mapping. That's already done for you in all of these. In this case, for this particular template, we're mapping a host, an IP, and a URL. And so those entity mappings are important to always make sure that they're done. And let's take a look at what happens when you've got matches. So these are the rules. I encourage you to play with these, and any of the log types that you've got imported that are supported by these rules, you can certainly just click enable and they'll run out of the box. If you have a custom log or a log type that's not represented by one of these templates, it's pretty easy to take an existing template and just modify it so that it's pointed to a different log. You might have to modify the regular expression a little bit if your custom log needs extraction of a URL or a file hash or something like that, if it's not very easily available in an existing column, for example. So if you run those analytics rules and you find matches, the system will generate alerts and incidents. And again, because these templates are pre-built mapping entities, when you generate incidents using these templates, you'll see that down here, we've got a malicious URL incident detected, and the host and the URL were actually mapped. And because they're mapped, we get this view called the investigation view, which shows the alert that generated this incident as well as the entities. And the nice thing about these is this really helps you investigate. You can right click on these entities and run additional queries. If it's a machine, you could say, give me all the people who have logged into this machine. You could say, what IP addresses has this machine had lately. In the case of URLs, all URLs that are part of alerts in Azure Sentinel are actually detonated by Microsoft. And so this is where you actually get the benefit of Microsoft Threat Intelligence built in with Sentinel. So all alerts, whether it came from one of those 26 analytics templates or your own logic, or you've imported those alerts from another system like Defender ATP, if those alerts contain URLs, Azure Sentinel will behind the scenes actually go and detonate those URLs. So what does detonation mean? It means we actually have a service that will take that URL, it will go to that URL, it will follow any of the redirects and find the final destination that path leads, and it will make a determination of whether we think that URL, the final destination, is actually malicious or not. If we do think it's malicious, we will note that, as we did in this case. We'll say that it's bad, our verdict is bad, and we'll grab a screenshot of the site from this final destination URL. This is a test URL, so we've got our own little screen grab there, but phishing sites often, try to pose as a bank site or something of that nature, or a service like Apple or Netflix or something. So it's kind of interesting to see what screens that those things are showing up after detonation. All right, so we've covered getting threat intelligence into the product. We've covered where to find it once it's in. We've covered how to use it in analytics, which is the most common scenario. We've talked about URL detonation in the product, which uses Microsoft Threat Intelligence. The other big area of the product that people want to look at is workbooks. So workbooks in Azure Sentinel are the place that you build dashboards with metrics and tables of interesting information. You can build these any way you like to have a dashboard that shows you all of the relevant information that you're most interested in the product. Many of the data connectors in Azure Sentinel come with their own workbooks. We have a built-in workbook specific to threat intelligence. It's built right in the product. So if you import threat intelligence in using those data connectors, the threat intelligence workbook will automatically light up, and you can open it up and see lots of interesting information about your threat intelligence right out of the box. The kinds of things you'll see in that built-in workbook are things like charts and graphs. In this case, we've got a chart showing the data that's been imported, the threat intelligence that you put in, broken down by different indicator types, file indicators, domain indicators, IP indicators, and URL. I know that these words are very small on the screen, so you probably can't see them. We have other charts that show you things, interesting data, like which of your threat indicators are actually generating the most alerts. So you can quickly see at a glance which indicators are trending in your organization. Very, very handy to have. We have other charts as well, things that kind of measure the efficacy of your threat intelligence feeds. So one of the important things about threat intelligence feeds is to understand how timely the threat intelligence is. So we have a chart that basically says, for any given feed in your system that's generated an alert, was that threat intelligence that was used to generate that alert something that you had in the system for a while before you saw the observed data? In other words, if I got an indicator for an IP address that said this IP address is a threat, and I got that a week ago, and then this week I see data in my network logs that actually match that threat intelligence, that means I've been protected for a whole week. That whoever provided that threat intelligence to me provided me a week's worth of protection. So that's a good thing. And we call that out in the chart, saying that threat intelligence is a week ahead of time. On the other hand, if I get a piece of threat intelligence today from a provider and I match in my system with observed data that came last week, that means that the actual threat happened in my organization a week ago, but I only found out about that being a threat this week. So that's not so good, and we consider that to be behind. And so we've got a chart in there that automatically tells you for all your feeds, generally, is this a feed that's providing you data well ahead of time, or is it a feed that's providing you data that's rather stale? The nice thing about these workbooks is it's 100% customizable. So these are really based, all of these charts in the threat intelligence workbook and all the other workbooks are just based off of queries. And so you can modify those queries very, very easily. You can edit the workbook. You can change the colors. If you don't like something, you can change the columns to pie charts. You can do whatever you like. So the templates, consider those as just a starting point. And you can take those any way you like or modify them. You can take certain charts out of one workbook and put them in another workbook to make a master, kind of dashboard for your organization. Workbooks are quite powerful. So I encourage you to play with those and get to learn them because they're very, 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 very good. So just a quick recap. What we talked about is getting threat intelligence into the platform is the most important thing. There's lots of different places to get it. There's open source feeds. There is proprietary vendors, Recorded Future, FireEye, IBM, AlienVault. Right, all of these folks and many more provide threat intelligence, either free or for sale. So import that into the product using our data connectors. Use the custom templates, at least as a starting point for you to do matching with the threat intelligence that you brought into the product with your data that you've imported into Azure Sentinel. Generating alerts and incidents is the most important thing you'll want to do with your threat intelligence. You'll get automatically URL detonation for any alerts that contain URLs, so Microsoft will detonate those for you. You'll see that in your investigation view. And you want to understand about the workbooks because those are where you're going to see the key performance of your threat intelligence in the product. They'll show you how many alerts you're getting, how many matches, how your TI is performing in general. There are other parts of the product that leverage threat intelligence that I didn't talk about today. Simply for the sake of time. There are actually really good blogs written on these on our tech community, particularly around the Jupyter notebooks. So if you're into Jupyter notebooks, which are super powerful, Ian Helen from our Microsoft Threat Intelligence team has written a great blog on how to use threat intelligence in Jupyter notebooks in Azure Sentinel. And then hunting queries, when you're doing ad hoc queries looking for suspicious behavior, or using hunting queries to investigate anomalies that you've detected through alerts. We have templates that have been added there that are very similar to the analytics templates that will help you match threat intelligence with other logs in the product in hunting queries, just like the analytics. So all of what I've talked about today and more is available in a written form in a blog. So I encourage you, if you're really interested in this topic, to take a look at that blog. Again, there's extra information in there beyond what we covered today, including how to use the command line tool to enumerate TAXII servers and collections and browse data there. So here's the short link to get there. And that's it. So thank you very much for joining us. Again, we do these every week, so I encourage you to log in and continue to learn about Sentinel and use the product. And we're always available to answer questions on the AKA MS security community, so feel free to hit us up there. And I think we have time for Q&A, so Balan, if you've got unanswered questions, I'm happy to field some of those.
Definitely, yes, we do. And thank you, Jason. And in addition to what Jason just mentioned, as far as the link goes, each of our webinar will be uploaded into our security webinars, aka .ms/security webinars. That's where you will find the recordings later. So yes, let's go through some unanswered questions here. Can Sentinel integrate with ServiceNow's incident response capabilities?
Yes, so not related to threat intelligence, but Sentinel does integrate with ServiceNow. So those are done through playbooks. So playbooks are things that fire in response to alerts generation. So if we go back to analytics in the product, we will see for any of the analytics, if we go ahead and look at an active rule and we say we're going to edit that rule, one of the things you can do is, oops, I'm sorry, try that again, is do an automated response. And here is where you can link to a logic app that connects to ServiceNow to do all of the incident management things that you'd want to do in one of those kind of systems. So there is a built-in, or excuse me, if you go to Azure Logic Apps, create a new Logic app, you'll see a ServiceNow connector there, and it exposes lots of different ServiceNow functionality in there about creating incidents, managing those incidents, etc. Typically, you want to do that in response to firing an alert.
Thank you for that. So the next one is, can Sentinel be integrated with Elk? Sentinel ingest log stream from Elk SIEM.
So it is possible to import data from one SIEM to another. Typically, what you'll do is you'll use the common event format connector. So if you go to data connectors and you're connecting from Elk, you'll look at the common event format. All of these style of connectors basically are push mechanism. So you'll set up a machine either on-prem where your Elk stack lives, or you'll set up a machine in Azure, for example. You'll install an agent on that machine, and this settings will help you configure that. It will take the data that you're pushing from your Elk stack up to that forwarder, and the forwarder will actually push all the data into the Azure Sentinel. It will land in the ceph log, in the common event format logs, so your data will show up in the common security log. This is where you will see all of that data reside.
Okay, great. And the next one is, will Sentinel be compatible with open source format Styx or Sigma in a near future?
Yes, so it is already compatible with Styx. So Styx is the most common threat intelligence format that we see out there. I've had many conversations with the technical steering committee that manages Styx and TAXII. And like I said, we support Styx 2.0 or 2.1. So if you have any TAXII server out there providing Styx formatted data in 2 or 2.1, you can use the threat intelligence connector for TAXII that we saw here. Import that. So all of these TAXII servers are actually pulling in Styx data. Next question.
Okay. What about Sigma?
Sigma is not something that we support today. If you have, I encourage you to shoot me an email over the tech community questions, and we can talk about whether Sigma is something that we need to support. Honestly, I've not had any customers ask for Sigma yet, so happy to entertain the idea of supporting it if we get enough customers asking.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. And the next one, does this import only apply to Sentinel or to your whole tenant? And
Great question.
And I guess more specifically, will it also apply to your tenant, like if the graph is used to pull threat intel, and will it be seen the intel pulled it through this method? Yeah.
So we talked about two different data connectors: the threat intelligence TAXII and threat intelligence platforms. So the threat intelligence platforms uses the Microsoft Graph API, as we talked about. You have to register an application to represent that whatever app you're using to push data. So that data actually is pushed for your entire organization. So it is available to any Azure Sentinel tenant, or excuse me, any Azure Sentinel workspace that you have out there. If you click the threat intelligence platforms and you go to that connector and you connect it, it will pull from that same pool of tenant level data. The nice thing about the Microsoft Graph integration is that threat intelligence is actually available for your organization for any other Microsoft product that you have that can use threat intelligence. Now, today, the only other product that can use threat intelligence at Microsoft is Defender ATP suite of products. So anything that you push through the Graph API, you can actually target at Defender ATP as well. I didn't get into the details, but when you go to one of those tips like ThreatStream or Palo Alto, one of the things that you configure in your connector when you're pushing the threat intelligence up to Microsoft is you specify a target product. And so the default we were talking about was specifying Azure Sentinel as a target product, but you could just as easily specify Microsoft Defender ATP, for example. We have quite a long list of other product groups at the company that we're talking to about supporting customer threat intelligence, things like Office, Azure Active Directory for identity protection, Cloud App Security, Azure Firewall, Azure Front Door. All of these services are interested in obtaining customer threat intelligence. It's all on their roadmaps. It's just going to be delivered over different cadences. So right now, the ones that supported today are Defender ATP and Azure Sentinel.
Thanks for that detailed explanation, Jason. So the next question is, are there example logic apps that enable you to leverage threat intelligence from the Graph API without a third-party solution?
So the Graph API doesn't have any data in it, any threat intelligence data, unless you put it there. As we just talked about from the last question, the data that you push to the Graph API is for your whole organization. And you can certainly have a logic app that taps into that and pulls it into Sentinel. And yes, there are templates that show you how to do that. We have those on GitHub, and I can provide pointers to those. We also have the blog that I mentioned from the tech community that talks about Alien Vault, and I can show that here. So at any rate, you have to provide threat intelligence from one source or another before you can use the Logic Apps connector to push it into Azure Sentinel. In this case, this blog is showing you how to connect to the Alien Vault third-party API and push it in using the Microsoft Graph connector. But you could just as easily, write your own custom application to push threat intelligence up through the API and then use the Microsoft Graph Logic Apps connector to get that into Azure Sentinel as well.
Okay, and we have a question on Zscaler, if it's supported for threat intelligence.
So Zscaler is supported in Sentinel not for threat intelligence today. They do not support STIX TAXII yet, to my knowledge. So that's on my list of folks to talk to. I'm talking to all of the threat intelligence providers out there that I can. The list is very long, and we're working with them to see when they're going to be supporting STIX and TAXII. Zscaler logs are something that is natively supported in the product already. You'll see data connectors for Zscaler in here already. But threat intelligence is not what comes through these logs.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is Sentinel free to monitor Azure resources?
So Sentinel has certain sets of data that you can import for free. Azure Activity is one of those. When you say Azure resources, that's a big question. I mean, so anything that comes in through the Azure Activity channel is free in Azure Sentinel, but you know, that question, I'm not sure exactly what the person asking it meant, but you know, Azure resources could be Azure storage, it could be, you know, Azure Compute, Azure VMs, Azure Service Bus, like all of those data have certain pieces of their data come in through the Azure activity, but other things like if you have Azure websites and you're doing logging from your application on that website, that log data, when you get it into Azure Sentinel, would be charged for ingestion because it is like coming from App Insights.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take this last question before ending the call. Is it possible to return information to threat intelligence platforms that we connect to?
Not at this time. So right now we have enabled all the plumbing to get threat intelligence into the Azure Sentinel and utilize it. We do have plans in our roadmap to go the other way and take threat intelligence out of Azure Sentinel and move it to other places. Since this is not a NDA discussion, we're not going to talk too much about roadmap, but yes, we are thinking about how to do that. It's not there today.
Sounds good. Okay, so just some reminders before ending the call. Our next scheduled webinars are on March 31st, Azure Sentinel, extending and integrating Sentinel. And then we have on April 2nd, Defender ATP. It's end-to-end security for your endpoints webinar. And then April 20, we have Azure Sentinel again with MSSP support. And April 22nd, Azure Sentinel on threat hunting using, it's actually threat hunting on AWS using Sentinel. And for details and registrations, I have also posted the link in the IM. This is where we keep all the future webinars and as well as the recordings of the past webinars. And that the link for that is aka.ms/security webinars. And in case we missed to answer your questions, or if you have additional questions, you can visit us on our Azure Sentinel forum at aka.ms/Azure Sentinel community. Thank you, Jason, for an excellent presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped answering the questions. And most of all, I would like to thank all of you for being part of our community and for joining us on these webinars. And we hope to see you guys next time. Goodbye.